The background of the story, nestled deep within the rolling plains of Montana, against the towering backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, lay a small rural paradise often romanticized in postcards. Tranquil sunsets over golden fields, the steady shuffle of cattle herding on endless pastures, and narrow dirt roads weaving through idyllic farmland. This was a slice of quintessential Americana, a place where neighbors waved to each other from their tractors, where homespun values were handed down like treasured family heirlooms, and where the rhythm of life moved as predictably as the change of seasons. The town was named Cresthaven, a close-knit farming community that prided itself on tradition and trust. Generations of families worked the same land, often trading stories about weather patterns and harvests at the local diner, where time seemed to slow down. Children played in open fields, their laughter carried by the wind, while parents worked hard to maintain the barns and machinery that defined their livelihoods. There was an unspoken understanding among its residents. People here lived simply, but they had everything they needed. The nearest big city was over an hour's drive away, and many in Cresthaven saw no reason to ever leave. However, beneath the veneer of this rustic utopia, shadows sometimes lurked, just out of reach. Grudges passed down like family feuds, whispered suspicions over towering cups of coffee, and a rigid sense of pride that stubbornly resisted being bent or broken. Cresthaven, for all its charm and community spirit, was a place where people knew everything about everyone, yet some secrets still festered in silence. Among its long-standing families was the Miller clan, whose ranch stretched far and wide, dominating the landscape. Albert Miller wasn't just a cattleman, he was the heart and soul of the town. At least, that's what people had always believed. Respected for his hardworking nature and commitment to his family, Albert was the very embodiment of the Midwestern farmer's ethos. Dedicated, stoic, and fiercely proud of his independence. His wife Maggie was equally admired, though she possessed the kind of beauty that always seemed slightly out of place in Cresthaven. She was vivacious, warm, and charismatic, forging an image of the perfect rancher's wife. Together, the Millers were the envy of many, a picture-perfect family leading a picture-perfect life. But as the seasons rolled by, subtle cracks began to appear. Small disputes with neighbors over boundary fences or borrowing machinery evolved into grating conflicts that left tempers frayed. Over the years, rumors swirled about financial issues within the Miller household, likely stemming from one particularly harsh winter when a disease swept through their cattle herd, and the family took a significant hit. Some speculated Albert had taken out loans, while others suggested Maggie had grown restless with the monotony of ranch life. It wasn't the kind of gossip aired loudly in Cresthaven, but rather muttered quietly in its back corners, perhaps at Saturday night bingo games or during church bake sales. These whispers, however, didn't prepare the town for what crept into the cold Montana winter one fateful December night. It was supposed to be another ordinary day. Frost covered the fields in a silver sheen, ranch hands worked diligently to prepare for the lean months ahead, and Cresthaven braced for an upcoming snowstorm. The townspeople certainly didn't anticipate the storm of fear and horror about to sweep through their small farming community. What drew the Miller family to the headlines wasn't a bumper cattle sale or even a drought-defying yield of hay. Instead, it was a story of violence, betrayal, and revenge that forever haunted both the Millers' ranch and those who knew them. Within a single night, this seemingly picturesque home, pristine white with a wraparound porch and the quintessential barn painted a deep red, became the epicenter of an unspeakable tragedy. What had once been a postcard-perfect symbol of idyllic countryside life would soon become infamous for something much darker. As the snow began to fall that frigid morning, Albert and Maggie Miller, alongside their children and a distant family member who lived with them, unknowingly became part of the kind of story that small towns like Cresthaven only hear about in newspapers from faraway places. Little did they know that the bonds built over years of shared meals, Sunday church services, and neighborhood gatherings would be unraveled in the hours to come. It's almost ironic in a way how a place so open and sprawling could also feel so isolating, a wide landscape where screams might echo for miles but never reach another human ear. Among the rattling fences and groaning barn doors, amidst the howling winds careening down the slopes of Montana's rugged peaks, the Miller family's ranch sat quietly before it became the stage for a tragedy more chilling than even the harshest of blizzards. What exactly tore apart the fabric of this peaceful existence? How could such a place of harmony descend into violence? These were questions that gripped the hearts of Cresthaven residents for years after the events of that December night. Just as snow blankets the Montana plains, concealing rocks and ruts beneath a smooth, deceptive surface, the town's calm exterior had hidden long simmering tensions, waiting only for the right spark to ignite it all. Cresthaven was never the same after that winter. The scenic landscape still welcomed visitors, but the shadows in its story lingered, casting doubt on the very idea that any place, no matter how picturesque, can ever truly be free from the darker sides of human nature. The chilling discovery on that fateful morning. It was a bone-cold Montana morning, the air so frigid it bit into exposed skin and turned each breath into visible clouds of steam. Jacob Henderson, a habitual early riser and lifelong rancher, was up and moving before the sun. His old truck sputtered slightly before roaring to life as he drove down a bumpy dirt road, his thermos of steaming coffee perched snugly in the cup holder. The frost that coated the barren fields sparkled under the dim light of dawn, giving the illusion of unbroken serenity. The world seemed perfectly quiet, with only the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional cry of a raven disrupting the silence. Jacob had always prided himself on his keen observational skills, ones honed over decades of ranching. It was a skill necessary for survival out here in the vast emptiness of rural Montana, picking out a predator near the herd or spotting a break in the barbed wire fence, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight waiting for him that morning. Driving past the Miller Ranch, Jacob's truck rattled along the familiar lane. He always enjoyed the sight of the pristine Miller homestead, the freshly painted bright red barn, the pristine white fencing that outlined their sprawling pastures. But today, something was off. He instinctively slowed the truck, leaning forward to peer out of the frost-lined windshield. The front yard of the Miller home looked disturbingly out of place amidst the frosted tranquility. At first Jacob couldn't place what was wrong, that is, until a dark red stain against the white snow caught his eye near the drainage ditch by the driveway. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he eased the truck to a stop. Blood. Not just a few drops, but a stark, sprawling puddle that trailed into the shaded ditch. "Lord Almighty," Jacob muttered under his breath, his voice cracking slightly as his heart started to pound against his ribs. He killed the truck's engine, the silence almost deafening as he stepped out into the icy morning air. The crunch of his boots against the frozen ground felt louder than normal, and he hesitated, glancing around as though he half expected someone to appear and assure him that all was well. But no one came. The scene in front of him grew more gruesome with each step closer. There in the ditch, nestled among icy mud and fallen leaves, was something unmistakable. A human head. A woman's face stared blankly at the pale sky, her long dark hair tangled and frozen stiff. Her expression was lifeless, empty, yet forever frozen in an expression of silent terror. Jacob stumbled back, the hot coffee in his thermos forgotten as it slipped from his hand and cracked against the frozen ground. His chest tightened, his breath short and shallow as the horrific realization settled in. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't an animal attack, this was murder. Shaking and barely able to think, Jacob forced himself to step closer, to look back toward the Miller house. The front door was slightly ajar, the winds pushing it open and closed with an eerie creak. Fear crawled up his spine. This wasn't just the head of an unfortunate stranger. Whoever this woman was, there would be more carnage inside that house. He was certain of it. Jacob clambered back to his truck, fumbling with gloved hands for his cell phone. His fingers trembled as he punched in 911, his voice shaking as he told the operator, There's been some kind of slaughter at the Miller place. God help us all. I think the whole family's gone." Paramedics and police arrived faster than anyone in that area had ever seen before. The sight of flashing red and blue lights against a backdrop of snowy plains was jarring, a surreal intrusion into the routine stillness of their lives. Sheriff Ben Harper, a grizzled man with decades of experience in law enforcement, wasn't the type to get rattled easily, but even he felt unease buzz in his chest as his boots crunched across the frost-covered driveway. The frantic barking of the Miller's two dogs, locked in their pen on the far edge of the property, was the only sound besides the whistle of the wind. Jacob had been right. The bloody trail outside was just the beginning. Inside the home, carnage unfolded like a nightmare frozen in time. The Miller family, the victims. The Miller family was one of the oldest and most well-respected families in Cresthaven, Montana. Their sprawling ranch, with its white fences and iconic red barn, was not just a symbol of their success, but also a testament to the hard work and resilience of the multi-generational family that called it home. The Millers embodied everything that represented the heartland of America. pride in their heritage, dedication to their land, and a commitment to community and family. Albert Miller the patriarch was a figure larger than life in the small community of Cresthaven. At 62, he had spent his entire life working the land inherited from his father. Albert was known as a man who spoke sparingly but carried tremendous respect among his peers. Tall and broad, he looked every bit the quintessential rancher, with calloused hands and a weathered complexion shaped by a lifetime under the burning Montana sun. Albert was a problem solver, the type of man neighbors turned to when hay bales needed stacking or when cattle went astray during a bad storm. Yet, Albert's greatest pride and deepest obligation was his family. His wife, Maggie Miller, was the sheer opposite of Albert's stoic demeanor. Maggie was a whirlwind of warmth and energy. At 58, she still carried herself with an air of vibrant strength, looking after the household and keeping the family tied together amidst the daily grind of ranch life. Known for her cinnamon rolls and her ability to soothe a neighbor's crying infant, Maggie was often described as the heart of the Miller family. But beneath that warm exterior was a woman deeply complex, quick to love but equally quick to hold a grudge, a trait that not everyone in the community saw with the same admiration Albert did. The Millers had two children who were at vastly different stages of life. James Miller, the oldest at 16, was a teenager grappling with the balance of adolescent rebellion and his father's expectations to eventually take over the family business. James was bright, ambitious, and occasionally frustrated by the life he'd always known, but wasn't entirely sure he wanted to continue. On weekends, neighbors might see him speeding down a dirt road on his rusted pickup, or practicing with his hunting rifle out in the woods. While James longed for some level of freedom beyond Cresthaven, he still had a fierce loyalty to his family, often defending his parents when rumors arose in town. In contrast, little Alice Miller was a wide-eyed dreamer. At just 7 years old, she was the source of unfiltered joy in the Miller household. Alice was the type of child to stop mid-field just to watch a butterfly fly by or to build elaborate snowmen on the ranch after a storm. A daddy's girl to her core, she often followed Albert on his morning rounds, asking him endless questions about cows, crops, and the seasons. Cresthaven residents often remarked on how Alice's laughter seemed to brighten even the gloomiest of cold, gray days. Rounding out the household was Maggie's brother, George Anderson, a recluse who had lived with the Millers for nearly 8 years. George, at 53, was a man of simple routines and few words. Following a messy divorce and the loss of his small auto repair business in the neighboring town, George had nowhere else to turn. Albert, despite their differences, offered George a room in the ranch house and work on the property. Though George rarely ventured into town, the locals who interacted with him claimed that behind his quiet demeanor was someone deeply troubled by his past, a man who struggled with demons he refused to speak about. However, the Millers welcomed him as family, despite his occasional outbursts of frustration or retreat into long silences. At face value, the Miller family seemed like the model of resilience and simplicity, a family that stood firm in tradition and self-reliance. But as much as they were loved in Cresthaven, they were not without their own faults and conflicts. Within the family itself, tensions often simmered beneath the surface. Albert, known for his unyielding standards, frequently clashed with James over how future responsibilities on the ranch would unfold. The older Miller held the ranch in almost sacred regard, while his son viewed it as more of a burden than a blessing. This divide became one of the more whispered-about topics during poker nights at the diner, a reminder that even the strongest families were human. Maggie's reputation for kindness often left her vulnerable to speculation as well. Some townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the Miller family's finances, especially after a harsh winter blizzard a few years back decimated their cattle herd. The chatter speculated that Maggie may have mismanaged a loan or even encouraged Albert to take costly risks to maintain the farmstead. Though the gossip never carried substantial proof, it was a crack in the otherwise polished image of the family, and one that may have added pressure on their sense of stability. If there was one universally felt truth about the Millers, it was that they lived as one cohesive unit. Every Sunday they took their place near the front pews at the local church, Albert with his weathered Bible, and Maggie singing the hymns with all her might. Afterward, they could be found at the diner, eating lunch with neighbors and often refusing to let anyone else pick up the tab. They were ingrained in the fabric of Cresthaven, a family many looked up to despite their occasional imperfections. And yet, it was precisely this closeness that made their end so incomprehensible to those left behind. How could a family so rooted in their values, in their land, and in each other fall victim to such unthinkable violence? What thread could have unraveled so catastrophically that their idyllic ranch was drenched, not in the golden hues of sunset, but in unspeakable tragedy? When their lives were snuffed out that December morning, it was not just a loss for the Miller family, it was a loss for the entire town of Cresthaven. This tight-knit, seemingly unshakable nucleus was nothing short of shattered. And in their absence, they left behind mourning loved ones, unanswered questions, and a haunting sense of fragility that no one in the town would ever truly recover from. The strange clues at the scene. As the sun crept higher into the pale Montana sky, thawing the ice that clung stubbornly to the trees and farm equipment, the Miller Ranch became a crime scene unlike anything the small town of Cresthaven had ever witnessed. The first responders, sheriff's deputies and local paramedics, were hardly equipped to deal with what they found. Many of them were accustomed to handling small-town issues such as bar fights, stolen farm equipment, or the occasional runaway dog. But this was uncharted territory. The crimson-streaked snow surrounding the property told a story of unspeakable violence. Blood trails led outward from the house, forming uneven, erratic lines as though someone, or something, had been dragged across the yard. A single set of boot prints, large and angular, was embedded in the frost, heading away from the house toward the nearby woods. The sight of the prints unsettled even the most seasoned deputy. It wasn't just their size but their depth, pressed so heavily into the ground that they indicated the wearer had been running or was carrying something immensely heavy. The front door of the house was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking ominously in the cold wind. Dark red smears marked the doorframe as though someone had grabbed it with bloody hands on their way through. It was the first unmistakable sign that the horrors outside were only a prelude to what lay within. Sheriff Ben Harper stood on the threshold, his grizzled hands trembling slightly as he reached for his flashlight. "All right," he murmured to the deputies at his back, his voice low but steady. "Buckle up, whatever's inside, it's gonna haunt us for a long time." Inside the Miller home, chaos reigned. The entryway and living room, once warm and welcoming with photographs of smiling family members hanging over the brick fireplace, now resembled a nightmarish butcher shop. Furniture had been overturned and the beige carpet was soaked dark red in several places. In the corner of the living room, the shattered remains of a coffee table were mingled with shards of ceramic mugs and an overturned plate of cookies, a haunting reminder that life in this house had been, just hours prior, shockingly normal. There were signs of struggle everywhere. Splintered wood from a broken chair littered the floor and streaks of blood led to the bodies of Albert and Maggie Miller on the far side of the room. Albert, ever the towering figure of strength in his community, now lay sprawled on the ground, his face battered and unrecognizable. Maggie was only a few feet away, her arms extended as if trying to reach for her husband. The fireplace poker, clutched tightly in her hand, was bent at an unnatural angle, suggesting she had gone down fighting. The kitchen was a sight of equal horror. The floor tiles, now slippery with congealed blood, bore bare footprints alongside the familiar pattern of boots found outside. A knife with a broken blade lay near the counter and the refrigerator door was half open as though someone had been searching frantically, either for something or for someone hiding within. The deputies noted that a glass of milk, still intact, rested on the kitchen table, its contents curdling in the growing warmth of the day. Toward the back of the house, where the family rooms were located, the grim pattern continued. James Miller, the family's teenage son, was found in his bedroom. His bedsheet, splattered with blood, was bunched up around him as if he'd been dragged from it. A hunting rifle leaned against the doorframe, its barrel bent and its trigger soaked with crimson. The walls of his room bore smear marks, horrifying evidence of his attempt to fend off his attacker before succumbing to his fate. The most haunting discovery, however, lay in the smallest bedroom of the house. Alice Miller's room, painted a cheerful pale pink with decals of butterflies and flowers still clinging to the walls, now bore the hallmarks of unspeakable tragedy. The 7-year-old's small body was discovered beneath the window, her tiny arms clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. The toy, once white and soft, was now stained beyond recognition, its fabric ripped and torn. Deputies fell silent when they entered her room, their breaths visible as the air seemed to grow colder. Even the sheriff, a man hardened by years of managing rural law enforcement, turned away briefly, unable to stomach the scene. The final discovery in the house chilled the investigation team to their cores. George Anderson, the family's reclusive uncle, had been found in the basement workshop. This was the one part of the property that remained relatively tidy and undisturbed, save for the collection of tools scattered haphazardly around George's body. His death was no less violent. His head rested on the workbench while his body slumped against the tool rack. A single hammer was found nearby, coated heavily in blood, likely turned against him by the assailant in a moment of ruthless efficiency. Aside from the victims, what made the scene truly bizarre were the strange and specific details left behind. Beside Maggie Miller's body, investigators discovered a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, placed deliberately near her outstretched hand. On the refrigerator door, written hastily with a marker, were the words, "What do you love most?" scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. In the family room, just under the coffee table, a child's drawing was found. The pencil-sketched picture depicted the Miller family standing together in front of their ranch, smiling, with a heart drawn over it, likely drawn by Alice. As the day wore on and forensic teams combed through the scene, one thought lingered in the minds of investigators. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. Whoever had orchestrated this crime wasn't simply looking to kill, they were sending a message. Outside in the biting cold, Sheriff Harper looked toward the woods in the distance, where the boot prints disappeared into the tree line. "Whoever did this," he muttered, "isn't just a murderer. There's something much worse." The tangled web of past relationships. For most outsiders, the Miller family seemed to be the epitome of stability in Cresthaven. Their tight-knit bonds and generations-long tenure on the ranch painted a picture of solidity, but to those who knew them well, or who paid attention to the murmur of conversations in the back corners of the local diner, a different story began to emerge. Beneath their almost idyllic facade lay a history of strained relationships, unresolved vendettas, and grudges that had been quietly festering for years. The Miller family's troubles had arguably begun more than a decade earlier, when Albert Miller's marriage to Maggie had brought her younger brother Luke Anderson into their lives. Luke, by all accounts, was the polar opposite of his industrious and stoic brother-in-law. While Albert believed in the reward of hard work and saw the land as sacred, Luke operated with a sense of entitlement that grated on everyone who had the misfortune of dealing with him. From the moment he set foot on the Miller ranch, he seemed at odds with its way of life. In his early 20s at the time, Luke had come to stay with the Millers after losing his job in a small auto shop in Billings. What was supposed to be a brief arrangement turned into a years-long burden for the family. Albert reluctantly allowed him to stay, mainly at Maggie's insistence, but it didn't take long for tensions to mount. Luke's refusal to pull his weight on the ranch led to frequent clashes with Albert, who despised laziness above all else. Albert wasn't the kind of man to express his feelings freely, but his disdain for Luke was palpable, and it was well known in town. Luke cemented his reputation as a troublemaker 5 years into his stay, when Albert accused him of stealing money directly from the family's savings. The situation had arisen after a particularly brutal winter season, when the Millers had suffered heavy livestock losses and were strapped for cash. The stolen funds, while not enough to bankrupt the ranch, represented months of painstaking savings the family had set aside for repairs and feed. Maggie had tried to mediate in what quickly became an emotionally charged feud, but Albert wasn't one to forgive lightly. He confronted Luke in front of several relatives during a family gathering, and the heated accusations devolved into a shouting match that ended with Luke being thrown out of the house. His few belongings were practically tossed out into the snow, and Albert made it clear he was never to set foot on the Miller property again. Luke didn't just leave with bitter anger that night. He left with a look in his eyes that unsettled the family. "You'll regret this," he'd hissed to Albert as he trudged away under the dark, frozen sky. It wasn't just the theft that soured the Millers' relationship with Luke. Rumors had circulated in Cresthaven about Luke's troubles with gambling and addiction. Some claimed he had spent many of his nights at a dingy backroom poker game run by the town mechanic, eventually accumulating a debt he had no way of paying off. Others whispered that he'd been caught trying to sell stolen ranch equipment at a scrapyard several counties away. Whether these stories were exaggerated or entirely true, they painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control, dragging the Miller family name down with him. Even after Luke left, his presence continued to haunt the family. When Maggie visited her brother in Billings 2 years later, she returned with tales of how desperate and bitter he had become. He was living in a run-down trailer on the outskirts of town, jobless and struggling to get by. Albert had wanted nothing to do with any conversation about Luke, brushing it off with firm finality. "A man makes his own bed," he'd mutter curtly. But Maggie couldn't shake the heavy guilt. Privately, she confided to a few close friends that turning Luke away that night, while necessary, had broken her heart. It wasn't something she could admit to Albert. In his eyes, Luke had made his choices, and they had no obligations to fix his mistakes anymore. As time went on, Luke's name became an occasional topic of hushed conversation around Cresthaven. While most people sided with Albert in the feud, some sympathized with Maggie's lingering softness toward her brother. But no matter what anyone believed, the story of Luke Anderson became one of the town's enduring pieces of gossip, linked forever with the Miller family's otherwise glowing reputation. When the horrific events at the Miller Ranch came to light that frigid December morning, Luke's name was one of the first to resurface. Suspicions about old bad blood, unresolved grudges, and the brooding anger he carried with him made him the immediate person of interest. To the investigators it seemed possible, if not likely, that Luke would have allowed years of resentment to fester into something dangerous. However, tracking Luke down only added more mystery to the case. When the authorities found him living in a tiny, poorly heated apartment in Billings, he denied any involvement in the tragedy and quickly offered a clear alibi. With his alibi confirmed by multiple witnesses who had seen him gambling in a back-alley poker room the night of the murders, suspicion shifted away from him. And yet, the encounter left investigators asking themselves, if not Luke, then who? What other tangled piece of the Miller family's past could have unraveled so violently? The mention of Luke Anderson didn't fade entirely, though. Investigators began to wonder whether his shadowy reputation and history of bad decisions had a deeper connection to the murders than met the eye. What secrets might he still be hiding? And could his expulsion from the Miller family have set something far more sinister into motion? The primary suspect, the rejected brother-in-law. From the moment word spread about the gruesome murders at the Miller Ranch, one name lingered on the lips of Cresthaven's residents: Luke Anderson, the brother-in-law no one trusted, the family outcast, the man whose banishment from the Miller household a decade ago left a wound that never quite healed, not in the eyes of those who knew him or the family he'd left behind. To the gossipy corners of Cresthaven, it almost felt inevitable. There was something dark, something dangerously unpredictable about Luke, and now many wondered whether all those years of bitterness had been festering into something far worse. Luke's reputation in town had never been sterling. While Albert Miller prided himself on being a disciplined and hard-working rancher, someone who spoke with purpose and acted with quiet steadiness, Luke was, by contrast, impulsive and unreliable. In his early years, Luke had been known as a carefree, somewhat reckless young man, but as time went on his flaws became harder to ignore. Gambling, drinking, shirking responsibility, these weren't just bad habits, they were a way of life for him. His problems came to a head a decade earlier during that bitterly cold Montana winter. Following months of rising tension, Albert accused Luke of stealing from the family's already thin savings. It wasn't just the money that infuriated Albert, it was the betrayal. To a man like Albert, who built his life on trust, hard work, and family loyalty, this was unforgivable. That explosive confrontation in which Luke was thrown out of the Miller house seemed to set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to that blood-soaked December day. The lingering bitterness was mutual. Luke left the ranch filled with rage toward his sister Maggie for failing to stand up for him more forcefully, rage toward Albert for banishing him to fend for himself in the harsh realities of life, and rage toward anyone who would dare take Albert's side. As he trudged away from the ranch that cold night, he shouted back at Albert, "You'll regret this. Mark my words, old man, I'll see to it one day." It was a moment no one present would ever forget, and it echoed more loudly in everyone's memories after the murders. Over the years, Luke's life spiraled deeper into dysfunction. He moved between a series of low-paying jobs, some legal, others less so. His known struggles with gambling only worsened, as he became a familiar face in the back alleys of Billings, playing in cash-only poker games that frequently ended in drunken brawls. He'd accumulated debts so large that his car was repossessed, and his name became a byword among Cresthaven neighbors for someone who had lost all sense of control. People believed Luke hated the Millers, Albert with his success and integrity, Maggie with her sympathy that fell short of outright loyalty, Even James, the teen who was now becoming the man Luke never could be. To Luke, they were everything he wasn't, stable, respected, and tied together by bonds of trust he felt excluded from. When Sheriff Ben Harper began piecing together early leads in the Miller case, Luke's name naturally rose to the top. Witnesses in town recalled his history of resentment toward Albert and his fiery temper that often turned physical. Adding to the suspicion, a local bartender mentioned overhearing Luke drunkenly proclaiming, "If it weren't for that bastard Albert, my life wouldn't be such a mess." The statement, though made years earlier, seemed chillingly prophetic. Tracking Luke down didn't take long. He'd been living in a decrepit apartment on the outskirts of Billings, its single window cracked and fogged from years of neglect. When the authorities knocked on his door, Luke answered wearing the same wrinkled button-down shirt he'd likely been wearing for days. His gaunt face and bloodshot eyes betrayed someone who wasn't living a life of comfort or sobriety. Initially defensive, Luke quickly denied having anything to do with the murders. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice hoarse and cracked from years of smoking, but his agitation was telling, the way his hands trembled as he spoke, the sudden flicker of panic behind his eyes when the Miller family was mentioned. Despite his protests, the rage he harbored toward Albert was written all over him. When questioned, Luke tried to deflect attention to anything but himself. "What about all those people who hated Albert? That man wasn't some saint like everyone thinks. You look under the surface of Cresthaven, and you'll find plenty of people with a bone to pick." But Luke's attempts at pointing fingers failed to convince investigators, at least at first. To bolster their case, the police scrambled to piece together Luke's movements on the night of the murders. His history of gambling provided a steady trail of witnesses. Strangely enough, it was his vice that cleared his name. Several poker players in one of his usual backroom games verified that Luke had been with them deep into the evening the night of the crime. A surveillance camera from a nearby convenience store captured him picking up cigarettes shortly before midnight, placing him miles away from Cresthaven around the time the murders occurred. Even his usual rivals vouched that they'd seen Luke lose $1,000 in cash that night, cursing loudly as he stormed off after folding a losing hand. The alibi was airtight. Despite being the perfect suspect in theory, Luke simply wasn't present when the murders unfolded. Yet, that wasn't enough to dispel lingering doubts. After all, could someone as unstable as Luke have paid someone else to act on his behalf? Was there a shadowy connection tying these events back to him, even if indirectly? As Luke's name was publicly cleared, the town remained hesitant to forgive and forget. "Might not have been him this time," one woman whispered to her friend in the diner, "but I'll bet he's connected. People like that, they always find their way into trouble." Yet for all the suspicions, the evidence told a different story. Luke Anderson, the disgraced brother-in-law who many believed had every reason to want revenge, was innocent, at least of this crime. But in clearing his name, the authorities were left with an even bigger question. If not Luke, then who? The investigation had only scratched the surface of the Miller family's tangled web of relationships, and as more names and grudges came to light, the dark truth behind the tragedy began to grow far more complicated. Luke may not have held the knife, but his rejection and bitterness remained an undeniable part of the family's messy history, a wound that ultimately shaped the events leading to their violent end. The key witness emerges. In a case that had already shaken the peaceful town of Cresthaven to its core, the discovery of a potential witness sent ripples of shock and renewed urgency through the community. For weeks, investigators had been sifting through evidence, rumors, and shaky alibis, with no clear breakthrough. The strange clues at the scene had pointed to something personal and calculated, but nothing concrete had tied any individual directly to the crime. The investigation was at a simmer, on the verge of going cold, when an unexpected figure stepped forward with information that would change the entire course of the case. The witness, Paul Reed, was an unlikely hero in a town like Cresthaven. A long-haul truck driver who passed through the area sporadically, Paul wasn't considered part of the tight-knit community. He'd stopped in Cresthaven only when his route brought him near, usually for breakfast at the diner or fuel at the local gas station. Nobody really noticed him when he was around, and frankly, that suited him just fine. With a history of keeping to himself and avoiding unnecessary attention, Paul wasn't the type to insert himself into someone else's drama. But what he had seen on the night of the Miller family murders left him unable to stay silent. Paul first approached the authorities quietly, pulling his weathered Chevy pickup into the sheriff's station parking lot late on a Wednesday evening. Sheriff Ben Harper, who was busy poring over the case files for what felt like the 100th time, was surprised to find the lanky, tired-looking man standing awkwardly at the reception desk. "You the sheriff?" Paul asked in a gravelly voice, tugging at the brim of his faded trucker hat. "That's right, what can I do for you?" Paul hesitated, shifting his weight nervously from one worn boot to the other. I think I might have seen something the night that family got, well, you know." Harper's eyes narrowed as he sized up the man. Witnesses in a murder case often came with their own agendas. A reward, 15 minutes of fame. But there was something different about Paul. He seemed genuinely uneasy, as though the mere act of coming forward had taken every ounce of courage he could muster. "Why don't you come into my office?" Harper said, gesturing down the hallway. Over the next hour, Paul recounted his story with the kind of detail that sent a chill up Harper's spine. On the fateful night of the murders, Paul had been driving back from a delivery in Billings. It was late, around midnight, and the winding back roads of Cresthaven were draped in darkness, punctuated only by the glow of his headlights and the occasional set of reflective eyes from a deer darting across the road. He didn't remember seeing another car for miles, a typical quiet Montana night, but as he approached a stretch of road near the Miller Ranch, something caught his attention. A figure was walking hurriedly along the edge of the road, heading away from the direction of the ranch. In the dim beam of his headlights, Paul could make out the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a heavy jacket and a snowcap pulled low. The man's posture struck Paul immediately. He was hunched slightly as though carrying something too heavy for comfort. Paul slowed his truck as he approached, his curiosity piqued. It wasn't often that you saw anyone walking out there so late at night, especially in freezing winter temperatures. "I thought he might have broken down, so I almost stopped to offer him a lift," Paul explained, his voice faltering. "But the guy, he just looked wrong, you know? Something about the way he was moving, all frantic-like." When Paul passed the man, his headlights briefly illuminated the figure's face. He didn't recognize the man, but the image was burned into his memory, unkempt stubble, darting eyes, and a wild, almost frantic expression. The man hadn't looked directly at Paul, but had quickened his pace as the truck approached, almost as if he were determined to disappear into the shadows of the road. "And then there was his hands," Paul added, his throat tightening. "They were covered in something dark. At first I thought it might have been oil or grease, you know, like a mechanic, but with everything going on now I can't stop thinking it was blood." The last piece of Paul's account sent a jolt through Harper. He remembered the man carrying something tucked under his arm, a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. Paul couldn't say for sure what it was, but the size and shape suggested it could have been a personal item, perhaps even a weapon. After passing the man, Paul admitted that his instincts told him to keep driving. He hadn't wanted to get involved in whatever trouble the stranger might have been in. Only later, when news of the Miller family murders reached him 2 days later, did the pieces start to come together. The road where he'd seen the man walking was only a few miles from the Miller Ranch, and the timeline fit almost too perfectly. Even so, Paul had wrestled with whether or not to speak up, fearing that coming forward so late after the fact would make him look suspicious or unreliable. It was the guilt that ultimately forced his hand. "I couldn't forgive myself if they didn't catch whoever did this 'cause I stayed quiet," Paul said, his gaze fixed on the floor of Harper's office. For Sheriff Harper and the investigation team, Paul Reed's statement opened up a new line of inquiry. The description of the man didn't match Luke Anderson, who many had initially suspected, nor did it fit the profile of anyone else in the family's inner circle. That left a chilling possibility. The killer might have been someone from outside Cresthaven, a drifter, or a figure from the Millers' past that even their neighbors had overlooked. With Paul's help, a composite sketch of the man was drawn, which soon became the centerpiece of the investigation. Flyers bearing the haunting image were distributed all over Cresthaven and surrounding towns. The question now wasn't just who the man was, but why he had been at the Miller Ranch that night. What was he carrying, and where did he disappear to after vanishing into the snowy backroads? Paul's testimony may not have solved the case, but it was a spark in an otherwise dark investigation. For the first time in weeks, the authorities had something tangible to chase. And for the exhausted townsfolk of Cresthaven, it meant that justice, elusive as it seemed, might still be within reach. The deeper motives of another suspect. As the investigation expanded, another name began to surface, a name that wasn't immediately whispered in the town's gossip circles but held an eerie relevance once unearthed. That name was Thomas Briggs. Unlike Luke Anderson, whose connection to the Miller family was public knowledge, Thomas lingered in the shadows of their history, a figure tied to Maggie Miller in ways many in Cresthaven never knew. To understand what drove Thomas to the unthinkable, one had to dig into his past, his connection to Maggie, his tumultuous life, and the toxic emotions that led to obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, a boiling thirst for revenge. Thomas Briggs wasn't a man of renown or respect. In his early 40s he moved aimlessly between jobs, carrying with him a reputation for being difficult to work with. In his younger years, Thomas had been a mechanic, known for his skillful hands and his short temper. He had a way with machinery but not with people. Life hadn't been kind to him, or so he often told others when drowning his grievances in cheap whiskey. His connection to Maggie Miller began nearly a decade before the events of that fateful winter. During a brief period of estrangement between Maggie and Albert, while their marriage hit a particularly rocky patch, Maggie had crossed paths with Thomas. All outward appearances at the time suggested that Maggie and Albert were the perfect ranching couple, but those close to the family recalled whispers of tension behind closed doors. Financial stress, the grind of ranch life, and Albert's unyielding pride had created a rift between them, one that Maggie had tried to resolve by seeking solace and distraction outside her marriage. Enter Thomas Briggs. Maggie and Thomas first encountered each other at a community event, one of the rare evenings Maggie ventured away from the ranch to attend a local barbecue hosted by distant acquaintances. Thomas, though not a typical fixture in Cresthaven, had been there as a favor to the event organizers, helping repair their faltering generator earlier that day. He appeared rough around the edges, unpolished compared to the other ranchers and workers in the community, and yet, his charm had an edge to it, a confidence born more of arrogance than strength. In her moment of emotional vulnerability, Maggie found herself drawn to him. Thomas, ever the opportunist, pursued her with an obsession that Maggie mistook for passion. For several months their affair remained a well-guarded secret. Thomas showered her with attention, pulling Maggie into a world that felt far removed from the pressures of the ranch. For a woman accustomed to the unspoken rules of duty and tradition, Thomas seemed thrilling, unpredictable, intoxicating. But as with most secrets, the affair unraveled. Staring into the consequences of her actions, Maggie made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She chose to return to Albert. In doing so, she severed ties with Thomas completely. It was a decision that brought stability back to the Millers' marriage and solidified Maggie's commitment to her family, but it left Thomas seething with betrayal. For Thomas, Maggie's decision wasn't just rejection, it was a humiliation that he couldn't bear. In his mind, Maggie wasn't just someone he had loved, she was someone who had abandoned him at his lowest. At the time, Thomas had been teetering on the edge of financial ruin. A string of poor decisions, including gambling debts and a failed attempt to start his own business, had left him with little to his name. When Maggie left, it wasn't just her love he lost. It was the last stable thread tying him to any sense of purpose or belonging. Over the years, Thomas's bitterness fermented into something darker. As his life spiraled further out of control, marked by evictions, bouts of unemployment, and escalating alcoholism, he fixated on Maggie as the source of all his misfortune. To him she represented not just rejection but betrayal. He convinced himself that she symbolized everything that had gone wrong in his life, the embodiment of every opportunity he believed had been ripped from his grasp. What made Thomas particularly dangerous was how quietly he allowed his resentment to grow. He never confronted Maggie directly, nor did he lash out publicly against the Millers. Instead, he held on to that grudge, letting it fester until it consumed him. From time to time, Thomas would pass through Cresthaven, blending into the background at the local gas station or liquor store, and those who spoke to him noticed a subtle, simmering intensity in his demeanor. But no one paid him much mind. After all, in a town like Cresthaven, drifters came and went without much thought. Unbeknownst to Maggie, Thomas harbored plans for vengeance for years. He watched from afar as the Miller family continued to grow their legacy. His obsession turned to twisted fantasies of taking everything Albert and Maggie had built, everything Maggie held dear. When the brutal Montana winter rolled in that fateful year, Thomas saw his opportunity. Isolated roads, a snowstorm forecasted, and the knowledge that the Millers' ranch sat miles from significant law enforcement presence. On the night of the murders, Thomas acted on years of brooding anger. Investigators pieced together his chilling series of actions. Armed with a hunting rifle and inebriated but fully aware of his goals, he drove toward the Miller ranch. The snowstorm provided perfect cover for his approach. He likely waited near the edge of the property, watching the house from the shadows, gathering his thoughts, or perhaps reliving every moment that had led him to this breaking point. His first target was Albert. Thomas saw Albert not just as the man Maggie had chosen over him, but as a living representation of all the stability and respect Thomas could never achieve. The living room became a battlefield, with Albert caught off guard and outmatched by Thomas's blind fury. Maggie was next. To Thomas it wasn't enough to simply confront her, he wanted her to feel the anguish he had carried for so long. Maggie, ever the fighter, attempted to defend herself and her family, but the attacker's rage overwhelmed her. From there, Thomas's rampage extended to the rest of the household, with no member of the Miller family spared. What made Thomas's actions all the more haunting was his lack of remorse when he was eventually captured. Witnesses at the bar where he was arrested reported hearing him drunkenly boast about teaching Maggie a lesson, his words slurred but chillingly clear in intent. During his confession, the years of pent-up resentment poured out, revealing a man consumed entirely by his imagined grievances. Thomas Briggs's motives were rooted deeply in his perception of betrayal, rejection, and entitlement. His inability to move forward, coupled with his self-destructive tendencies, propelled him into a downward spiral that culminated in an unspeakable tragedy, a tragedy that forever shattered the Miller family and scarred the town of Cresthaven. The Night of Terror on the ranch. The night of December 12th was one of the coldest Cresthaven had seen in years. Heavy snow blanketed the fields, and the bitter winds howled through the wide Montana plains. The Miller family's ranch, silent and solitary in the sprawling expanse of land, seemed like the perfect picture of serenity. Pristine white snow draped over the red barn, the distant lights of the house glowing warmly against the icy darkness. But that calm hid a storm brewing within, a storm far darker than the winter around them. Inside the Miller home, everything had started as it always did, routine, even mundane. Albert Miller, as tough as the Montana land he worked on, had just finished a long day overseeing the cattle and prepping the ranch for the impending snowstorm. Even in his 60s, his hands bore the firm calluses of a man who refused to slow down, no matter how much his wife Maggie pleaded for him to make things easier on himself. That night he sat in his favorite armchair by the fireplace, watching the flames lick lazily at the logs. It was his ritual, a small slice of peace before starting all over again the next day. Maggie Miller, always bustling with energy, was in the kitchen baking. The warm aroma of fresh cinnamon rolls hung in the air, a comforting contrast to the icy chill creeping in through the old windows. She hummed in rhythm, with the faint crooning of Johnny Cash playing softly on the radio. Upstairs, her teenage son James was in his room, tinkering with the scope on his hunting rifle, a gift from Albert he had received on his 14th birthday. He loved the precision it gave him when shooting targets on the far corners of their land. Meanwhile, 7-year-old Alice giggled in her room, nestled in a cocoon of blankets as she ran her fingers through the fur of her favorite stuffed rabbit. Life in the Miller household, despite its struggles, still had quiet moments of joy. But lurking outside, the ranch no longer belonged to them. The predator was already there. Thomas Briggs had been watching from the edge of the property for hours. His face stung from the biting wind and his breath clouded in the frosty air as he gripped the rifle slung over his shoulder. Patience wasn't his strong suit, but this moment was years in the making. He clutched a half-empty flask of cheap whiskey in one hand, taking quick, angry gulps as bitter thoughts swirled in his mind. He replayed every memory of being spurned, of being watched from afar as Maggie and Albert rebuilt what he believed he had lost. It had taken everything inside him to wait for this night, to let his rage fester, to turn his bitterness into something deadly. Shortly after midnight, Thomas made his move. The snowstorm had picked up, covering much of his tracks but also adding an eerie quiet to the ranch. He approached the back door of the house, careful to avoid the crunch of snow beneath his boots. Only the wind howled, masking the sound of his occasional misstep. The rifle clutched in his hand seemed to radiate with purpose, a twisted extension of his anger. The back door creaked open without much resistance. It was an old ranch, and locks weren't something the Miller family thought much about in a town like Cresthaven. They trusted their neighbors, and the isolated safety of their land. For Thomas, it was almost too easy. Albert was the first to hear the faint groan of the door over the crackle of the fire. His senses, honed from years of ranch life and countless run-ins with predators, were razor-sharp. Rising from his chair, he called out, "James, you leave that door open again?" But before he took another step, A shadow emerged from the hall. There was no time for words. The crack of the rifle tore through the quiet home, shattering not just the window nearest the fireplace but the security Albert had spent decades building for his family. The bullet hit its mark, and Albert fell to the floor, the crimson bloom of his blood spreading too quickly against the beige carpet. His hand twitched, reaching for anything, but there was nothing to grab. He never had the chance to fight back. Maggie screamed from the kitchen. It was the kind of sound that carried anguish, terror, and defiance all at once. She didn't run. Maggie Miller wasn't the type to cower. Instead, she snatched the fireplace poker from its holder in the den, gripping it with an almost primal strength, and charged toward the figure in the doorway. Wild-eyed, Thomas swung the butt of his rifle at her, and the two collided violently in the narrow hall. Maggie fought fiercely, landing a blow that left Thomas momentarily staggered, but her courage wasn't enough to overpower the drunken, feral rage consuming him. A second shot rang out, and with it, Maggie collapsed against the wall, her lifeblood pooling at her feet. Upstairs, James froze. The sounds, the gunfire, the angry bellowing, his mother's final cry, sent a cold shock down his spine. He grabbed his hunting rifle, his instincts screaming for him to protect his sister. But as he stepped onto the landing, Thomas charged up the stairs, his boots thudding against the wood like thunderclaps in the silent house. James raised his rifle, but Thomas was faster. A struggle ensued, more violent and frantic than anything Thomas had faced downstairs. James was no longer just a scared teen. He was a son defending what was left of his family, but rage and brute force won out. After disarming James, Thomas used the boy's own rifle to end his life. Alice, the youngest, had tucked herself into the corner of her room. She clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly its seams began to rip. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she prayed that her brother or her daddy would save her. But when Thomas burst into her room, there was no mercy. To him, she wasn't an innocent child. She was a symbol of Maggie's life, the life he didn't get to have. When he left her lifeless on the floor, the house fell silent. The scene didn't end with the family. Down in the basement, George Anderson, Maggie's reclusive brother who had lived with them for years, made a final stand. Cornered and panicked, George grabbed the first tool his trembling hands could find, a hammer, but Thomas, already drenched in the carnage of the night, overpowered him with brutal efficiency. George's body was found slumped against the workbench, the hammer still inches from his lifeless grip. By the time dawn began to creep over the Montana horizon, the Miller Ranch was no longer a refuge. It was a house of horrors. Blood stained the furniture, the walls, even the frost-covered earth outside. What had started as a cold winter night ended as a tragedy Cresthaven would never forget. What remained were the echoes, the faint swinging of an ajar door, the silent photographs on the mantel, and a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, left purposefully in the center of the carnage, as if it were Thomas's final message. Love, in his broken mind, was what destroyed him. The hunt for the killer. The night after the Miller family tragedy, the town of Cresthaven was frozen in both fear and shock. What had once been a quiet rural paradise now felt haunted by the specter of blood and unimaginable violence. Word spread faster than the winter winds. Someone had shattered the peace of the Miller Ranch, and that someone was still out there. For the townsfolk, the thought of a killer roaming the snowy plains, hiding in the shadows just beyond their fields and barns, was enough to send shivers down even the steeliest of spines. Locks were secured, guns were loaded, porch lights burned brighter than usual, though no one dared to venture outside. While the residents of Cresthaven tried to make sense of the tragedy, law enforcement mobilized into action. Sheriff Ben Harper, a grizzled man who had spent his career dealing with cattle thefts and domestic disputes, suddenly found himself at the helm of the largest manhunt in the town's history. This wasn't just a murder, it was a massacre. Harper, ever pragmatic, knew the clock was ticking. Whoever had left that scene of carnage at the Miller Ranch wasn't planning on sticking around. The snowstorm that everyone had initially blamed for delaying news of the crime was also their biggest enemy now. Fresh tracks, tire marks, and any physical evidence of the killer's escape would soon be buried under layers of Montana's relentless winter. The hunt began the very next morning. Harper called in reinforcements from the state police, and by noon, federal agents arrived to assist with a case that was already being described as one of the most grotesque to hit the region in decades. Helicopters buzzed low over the sprawling Montana plains, while search teams on snowmobiles fanned out in all directions, combing through the frozen wilderness for any sign of the man responsible. But it wasn't just the professionals out there. Many of Cresthaven's locals, rugged ranchers and retired hunters, volunteered to join the search, rifles slung across their backs, determined to bring justice for the Millers, a family everyone in town had known, respected, or envied in some way. "We're not dealing with just some outsider," Harper declared at a community meeting held in the town hall that same night. His voice was firm, but the tension in his jaw gave away the pressure mounting inside him. This wasn't random, this was personal, and that means this guy has a plan, or at least he thinks he does. One name stood out immediately: Thomas Briggs, the same man who had been both fiercely loyal and painfully obsessive toward Maggie Miller a decade earlier. Investigators were already familiar with his troubled history and the timeline of his resentful, spiraling downfall, but Briggs had vanished, almost as if the storm itself had swallowed him. Sheriff Harper, alongside the FBI, traced Briggs's last known whereabouts. Witnesses at a nearby gas station claimed they'd seen an agitated man matching his description about 8 miles east of the Miller Ranch, walking along a back road and smoking from a hand-rolled cigarette. But after that, nothing. Normally, someone like Briggs, with his unreliable temperament, would have been caught loitering at a tavern or pitching camp in a notable spot. But the landscape was unforgiving this time of year. Forests of pine and spruce stretched for miles in every direction, and the Rocky Mountain foothills provided endless places to hide, especially for someone accustomed to surviving rough conditions. The breakthrough finally came on the third day of the search, when one of the aerial patrol teams spotted something peculiar near the dense forest line to the west of Cresthaven, faint traces of smoke coming from what appeared to be a small cave nestled between thick snow-covered rocks. The trails leading to the area, almost imperceptible from above, hinted at recent foot traffic. Search teams quickly mobilized while Harper looked over the coordinates spread across his desk. His initial instinct was caution. Charging recklessly into the icy wilderness could spell disaster for his men. But time wasn't on their side. If there was reason to believe the killer was holed up in that cave, Harper wasn't about to lose the element of surprise. By twilight, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles and snowmobiles had surrounded the area, blanketed in eerie silence. The snow muffled their movements, and breaths clouded in front of their faces as they communicated quietly over radios. At the entrance to the cave, charred remnants of kindling etched a story of someone who had been using the spot as a base, someone desperate to stay warm in impossible conditions. The sheriff's team approached cautiously, guns drawn, their steps slow and deliberate over the uneven snow. "Thomas Briggs!" Harper bellowed into the icy cavern, his voice echoing off the frost-coated rock walls. "We know you're in there! There's no way out but through us!" The response was instantaneous, though not verbal. A gunshot cracked through the evening air, ricocheting off the stone and splitting the quiet night. Panic rippled through the deputies, some of whom instinctively ducked for cover. It became obvious then that Briggs wasn't going down without a fight. More gunshots followed, although it was difficult to tell whether Briggs was aiming at his pursuers or simply warning them to stay at bay. Harper, his jaw set, ordered the team to stand firm and not return fire unless absolutely necessary. He still believed in a resolution that didn't end with more bloodshed. If Briggs could be captured alive, they'd have the answers to the questions haunting all of Cresthaven. Why? Negotiators were called in as darkness fell completely over the forest. A back and forth ensued for nearly 2 hours, with Briggs shouting from the depths of the cave about love, betrayal, and vengeance. His words slurred, his anger raw and unbridled. "She owed me everything!" he screamed at one point, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "You don't know what she took from me!" But something shifted as the night drew on, whether it was fatigue, the cold biting at his sanity, or the realization that he'd been cornered. Briggs's bravado eventually gave way. His voice grew quieter and quieter with each response until suddenly there was only silence. Harper, who had been listening intently to every bitter word, motioned for his team to proceed. When they entered the cave, rifles aimed and flashlights scanning every inch, they found Briggs slumped against the wall, shivering uncontrollably. His weapon lay on the ground beside him, and his hands were raised in surrender. He was half-starved, having survived on nothing but whiskey and stolen canned goods for days. Captured at last, Briggs offered no resistance as they led him out of the snowy wilderness and into the back of a squad car. Under the piercing glare of artificial light, his gaunt face betrayed none of the triumph he had once felt. Instead, he looked hollow, like a man who had finally glimpsed the ruin he had wrought. As he was driven into town, harrowing questions loomed in the minds of everyone. What kind of hatred could fuel such a crime? What compelled a man to destroy an entire family piece by piece? And most chillingly, was this truly the end of the darkness that had descended upon Cresthaven, or were there still secrets left untold about what had happened that fateful December night? The hunt may have been over, but for Cresthaven, the scars of that pursuit would linger long after the snow melted away. The trial. The trial of Thomas Briggs was destined to become one of the most infamous proceedings in Montana's history. In a state where ranching values and tight-knit communities formed the backbone of its identity, the sheer brutality of what had happened at the Miller Ranch was unthinkable. For the town of Cresthaven, still grappling with the echoes of violence that had shattered its calm, the courtroom became a stage, not just for justice, but for the collective reckoning of the trauma that had been left behind. The courthouse was a modest structure flanked by snow-dusted pine trees, standing as a stark representation of frontier justice. Normally it handled simple civil disputes, arguments over boundary lines, overdue debts, or petty theft. But over the weeks leading up to Briggs's trial, reporters from across the state flocked to Cresthaven, their cameras and microphones turning the sleepy town into an unexpected media hub. The public's appetite for the grotesque and dramatic seemed insatiable, and the Miller family's massacre delivered on both counts. The courtroom had to be specifically arranged to accommodate the crowd, with additional benches brought in, and the proceedings streamed to a nearby overflow room. Thomas Briggs arrived for his preliminary hearings in late February, escorted by heavily armed deputies. The image of the defendant immediately struck a nerve within the town. Gone was the snarling predator who had cornered himself in a cave during the manhunt. Here, Briggs looked almost pitiful. His sunken eyes and gaunt frame, his prison jumpsuit hanging loosely from his shoulders, gave the impression of a man hollowed out by his own fury. But any sympathy these optics might have earned him burned away like frost in sunlight the moment a single detail emerged. He felt no remorse. From the start, Briggs's behavior was erratic and cold. During questioning, he spoke with a mechanical lack of emotion, describing his actions at the Miller Ranch almost as a sequence of logical steps. To him it wasn't murder, it was retribution. "They took everything from me," he muttered more than once under cross-examination, his voice quiet yet venomous. His inability or refusal to acknowledge the humanity of his victims sent chills through the room every time he spoke. The trial officially began in late March, with a heavy snowfall blanketing Cresthaven. Judge Eleanor Hawks presided over the proceedings, her reputation for fairness bolstered by a no-nonsense demeanor that kept the courtroom in line. With silver hair pulled into a stern bun and glasses that gave her a hawk-like scrutiny, she became the steady hand guiding what threatened to spiral into chaos. The prosecution was led by Montana State's Attorney Richard Calloway, a middle-aged bulldog of a man who had built his reputation around high-profile homicide cases. His determination was unmistakable. He intended to bring Briggs to justice not only for the sake of the Miller family but to ensure that Cresthaven's shattered sense of safety was restored. The case laid against Briggs was airtight. The forensic evidence gathered from the Miller Ranch told a story that left no room for doubt. Blood spatter analysis directly tied Briggs to multiple rooms of the house, from the living room and kitchen to the upstairs bedrooms. The rifle he had used to kill Albert and James matched the bullets recovered at the scene. Shoe prints found in the freshly fallen snow around the property were a perfect match for the worn-out boots Briggs had been wearing. And most damning of all, Briggs's own confession, made during his arrest in the freezing cave, confirmed everything investigators suspected. But beyond the technicalities of guilt, it was the emotional weight of the family's story that dominated the trial. The prosecution didn't just present facts, they painted a visceral picture of the horrors those final moments inside the Miller home must have held. Calloway stood before the jury with photographs of the crime scene and described in painstaking detail how each member of the family had been brutally and senselessly taken from the world. "This man," Calloway said during his opening statement pointing directly at Briggs, "did not just destroy a family. He ripped apart an entire community. He did not just kill, he defiled their sanctuary, a home that family built with their own two hands and left it drenched in blood. He did all of this, not out of desperation, not in defense of his life, but out of pure, unbridled hatred." The defense, led by a somewhat reluctant local attorney named Dale Warren, struggled to keep the case from feeling like a foregone conclusion. Warren leaned heavily on Briggs's history of mental instability, his descent into alcoholism, and decades of untreated trauma. He argued that Briggs was not in full control of his actions, and that his obsession with Maggie Miller had warped his ability to distinguish rational thought from delusion. "What we have here," Warren told the jury, "is a man broken by his circumstances. While his crimes are undeniable, we cannot ignore the deep fracture of his mind, a fracture that left him unable to see the world as we all do." But Briggs himself was his worst enemy. During one pivotal moment, the defense attempted to paint him as remorseful, a man haunted by his actions once the anger subsided. Yet, when Briggs was called to the stand, his answers were chillingly devoid of regret. At one point, Calloway seized the opportunity to press him, asking directly, "Did you even think about the lives you were taking, about the children?" Briggs paused, leaned into the microphone and answered flatly, "I thought about Maggie. I thought about what she owed me." Gasps echoed through the room, followed by murmurs of disgust. The town of Cresthaven showed up in droves to witness the proceedings, many hoping for some semblance of closure. Friends of the Millers sat in the gallery, their faces lined with grief and exhaustion. Maggie's best friend, who had baked bread with her every Sunday morning, broke down in tears the first time crime scene photos were displayed. A ranch hand who had worked under Albert for nearly 2 decades sat silently, gripping his hat in his lap with white knuckles. But it was Rusty O'Connor, the Miller family pastor, who delivered the most gut-wrenching testimony during the sentencing phase. Standing at the podium, his voice trembling, he recounted how he had officiated Albert and Maggie's wedding and baptized their children. "This town has lost more than just a family," he said tearfully. "We've lost the heart of what made us whole." On the final day of the trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, home invasion, and aggravated assault. When Judge Hawks handed down the sentence, death by lethal injection, there was no applause, no outward celebration, just a heavy silence that weighed on everyone in the room. Justice had been served, but it could not undo the scars left behind. When Briggs was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he stumbled slightly, shooting one final glance into the gallery. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath, though no one could quite tell who the words were meant for. For Briggs, the trial had ended, but his bitterness remained an eternal companion. For Cresthaven, life moved forward, though never quite the same again. The trial had closed the book on Thomas Briggs's deeds, but for many, it would take years to heal from the loss, the fear, and the shattering of what they thought their town meant. In whispers and quiet conversations over coffee, people would describe it as a necessary justice, but no one felt victorious. The Miller family was gone, and no verdict, no sentence could change that. The heartbreaking lessons from the tragedy. In the quiet town of Cresthaven, where life was once measured by the familiar rhythms of seasons and harvests, the Miller family tragedy became an unshakable reminder of how fragile the bonds of humanity truly are. With every fresh snowfall covering the Montana plains, the scars left by that cold December night remained etched into the hearts of its residents. Beyond the horror, beyond the trial, beyond the grim headlines, the story of the Millers forced Cresthaven to confront truths about love, loss, and the dangerous power of resentment. The Miller family had always represented something larger than themselves. They were deeply tied to Cresthaven's identity as a community. Church-going ranchers who worked hard, helped neighbors without hesitation, and made others feel safe within the borders of their shared world. Albert's stoic strength, Maggie's warmth, James's determination, and Alice's innocence symbolized the integrity small-town America prided itself on. But the calamity that tore them apart exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most admired families. For Sheriff Ben Harper, the tragedy was a reminder of the terrible cost when tensions of the past go unresolved. "We always think we've got time," Harper told a gathering of townsfolk during a community vigil. "Time to mend fences, time to rebuild trust. But sometimes we run out of it. Sometimes we don't see the cracks beneath the surface until it's too late." The weight in his voice was palpable, as he spoke not just as a lawman but as a member of their grieving town. What had been obvious to investigators and neighbors alike was that the seeds of destruction had been planted long before that night. At the core of it all was Thomas Briggs, a man who had allowed bitterness and obsession to guide his every action. His slow descent into darkness told a chilling tale of what happens when pain festers unchecked. For years the community of Cresthaven had known Briggs as a drifter and a troubled soul. Yet much like the harsh winters they endured, people believed his issues were distant, manageable, or simply none of their concern. Few, if any, offered help, and even fewer noticed just how deeply his anger had turned inward, poisoning his thoughts until he could see no clarity beyond the warped lens of his grievances. It was easy to dismiss him as a failure rather than face the larger truth. His dangerous spiral had been hiding in plain sight. As the details of Briggs's decade-long vendetta against Maggie came to light during the trial, the town reflected on the risks of leaving grudges unresolved. Many began to question how such hatred could have simmered and boiled over without their notice or intervention. While responsibility for the heinous acts lay solely on Briggs, the tragedy raised uncomfortable questions about whether Cresthaven's culture of guarded privacy and neighborly distance had contributed to an environment where conflicts could quietly escalate unchecked. The tragedy also laid bare uncomfortable truths about the stigmas surrounding mental health in a blue-collar town like Cresthaven. Briggs's actions were those of a man consumed by his own demons, but for years he had been visibly struggling. His alcoholism, erratic behavior, and inability to hold down work were whispered about but never properly addressed. It always felt easier to look the other way, one church member confessed months later during a town hall meeting on community healing. Because that's how it's always been here. We don't dig into other people's business unless they ask. But the Miller tragedy made clear that silence, in some cases, could be just as destructive as anger. For families like the Andersons, Maggie's extended relatives, or close friends of the Millers, the aftermath of the killings wasn't just about grief. It was about reflecting on unspoken regrets, missed opportunities for reconciliation, and the urgency of rebuilding trust where fissures had formed. Luke Anderson, once suspected of harboring his own grudge against the Millers, quietly returned to the outskirts of Cresthaven following the trial. He rarely spoke publicly of his sister, but on the night of her memorial, he was overheard saying, "She never gave up on people, even when she should have. I just hope that counts for something now." The small-town values Cresthaven had long cherished, self-reliance, resilience, and privacy, were now under examination. Could those values coexist with greater awareness and accountability to one another? Did neighborly respect mean keeping one's distance, or did it mean stepping in when someone seemed to be fighting their own battles with no end in sight? One notable change in the months after the trial was the emergence of community-led efforts to address emotional well-being and conflict within the town. The local church became the center of these initiatives, organizing regular forums where neighbors could voice concerns or offer help without judgment. Sessions on conflict resolution, mental health awareness, and even addiction recovery attracted surprising turnout. Sheriff Harper himself attended one of the sessions, speaking openly about how the tragedy had forced him to rethink his role as a protector, not just of people's homes and fields, but of their relationships and well-being. Rusty O'Connor, the town pastor who had delivered emotional testimony during the trial, took it upon himself to champion forgiveness and healing. His sermons began to weave together the lessons from the Miller tragedy, urging people to reconcile before it was too late. "Grief has taught us something we should never forget," he said during one service. "The fences we build to protect ourselves from one another can also keep us from saving each other when it matters most." But not all wounds healed smoothly. For some in Cresthaven, the tragedy left behind resentment and fear. Farmers who had once left their doors unlocked at night now double-bolted them. Stray questions about whether past quarrels might escalate into something darker loomed louder. The idyllic sense of safety that had defined their town had vanished, replaced by a quiet wariness. Relationships that had once thrived on unspoken trust were now tinged with an edge of suspicion. For the families of victims, the most heartbreaking lesson of all was the fragility of harmony. Maggie Miller had been someone who fought to hold her family together even when tested by the weight of past mistakes. Albert, though stern and set in his ways, had acted as the foundation on which the household stood. James and Alice were representations of what Cresthaven itself had once been, a mix of resilience and youthful hope. Their senseless deaths underscored just how easily the threads of a closely knit community could unravel, leaving behind only the frayed edges of what might have been. As Cresthaven pieced itself back together, the tragedy remained a haunting presence, both a wound and a warning. The Miller family had been broken not just by murder but by the unchecked forces of jealousy, silent pain, and unresolved anger, and so, the town carried forward not just grief, but an unspoken promise to see one another more clearly, to listen when it was inconvenient, and to fight for the connections that made life worth protecting. Because, in the wake of such tragedy, the cruelest lesson of all was this: none of it had to happen.